So I finally got around to swapping my 5800X3D for a more up-to-date 9800X3D, all in the pursuit of better performance in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. As for the hardware we've got paired with it, we've got a 64GB kit of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory on an MSI Pro B850P Wi-Fi motherboard, and taking care of thermals, we have a Peerless Assassin CPU cooler. So I think it's fair to say that I went into this upgrade with my eyes fairly well open. I'm not hoping for crazy high FPS numbers here, but what I am hoping for is to stay comfortably above 30 FPS when on final approach into a busy handcrafted airport when connected to VATSIM. Will I get it? Well, let's find out. So what's going on? We're here in the Fenix A320 at Edinburgh V2 from PMDG in Sim Update 2, running at 4K in the Ultra preset. So more or less a worst case scenario in terms of performance. We're looking at the 5800X3D system right now, and we're getting around about 40 FPS looking straight ahead on runway 24 with the plane powered on. So then presumably we're going to get an absolute ton more FPS with the 9800X3D, right? Well, not with the out-of-the-box settings we won't. As you can see, with the 9800X3D, we're only getting around 45 FPS, which when you consider this upgrade will cost, the better part of £800 to £1,000, depending on what motherboard route you take and RAM, etc. Doing all of that for 5 FPS isn't great. But before we rage quit, it's important to remember that the devil is in the detail, so let's look closer. You'll notice that when we're running our 5800X3D, the sim's performance is limited by the main thread on the processor, meaning we could chuck in a 5090 and get no more performance whatsoever. The processor is the limiting factor. Now, if we go back to the 9800X3D, you can see that we are no longer limited by our CPU. We're in fact limited by the GPU at the AMD 7900 XTX in my case. But we are, after all, running at 4K on the Ultra preset. I wouldn't normally run on the Ultra preset. I tend to tweak my graphic settings down from Ultra to get a bit more performance while keeping almost all of the visuals. So if we weren't running at 4K, being limited by our GPU, what could the 9800X3D get? How powerful is it really? Well, to find out, let's switch to 1440p, and you can see now we're back to being limited by our main thread on the CPU. So we're back to being CPU limited, but this time we're getting around 55 FPS, which in the Fenix A320 at Edinburgh V2 from PMDG isn't bad going at all. We are so close to 60 FPS. And again, you might be thinking, well, that's still quite a lot of money to upgrade to only get 15 FPS more. But for me, this upgrade wasn't really about getting more FPS necessarily. It was to keep me out of the kind of 20, 25, 28 FPS range while on final into a busy airport on VATSIM. And sitting on the runway looking ahead is one thing, but actually flying is another thing altogether. So let's keep testing. And here we are now coming into land into Edinburgh in 4K using my optimized graphic settings, which you can find here. And we're not running any dynamic settings or AutoFPS. We've got no upscaling going on or frame generation. This is just my preferred graphic settings at 4K with TAA. We're also running using the Sim Update 3 beta, and all the tests that follow will also be running the Sim Update 3 beta. We can't actually be that far off the release at this point at the time of recording. All the landings are going to be an auto land for consistency between tests, and we're using good old FSI panel to set the plane up for our approaches. A great little app for practicing your landings. If you haven't heard of it already, go check it out. So on approach, you can see that we are almost at 60 FPS, but not quite. And, look how we're kind of bouncing between being main thread limited and being limited by the GPU, which I guess is quite a good sign that our system is kind of in balance, really, versus one component constantly limiting. I mean, no matter what you buy, you're going to be limited by either your GPU or your CPU eventually. So don't be mad at the component that it's limiting you necessarily. It's more a question of, are you happy with the performance you're getting once you are limited? Like, for example, I was playing Call of Duty Warzone the other night, don't judge me, and I think I was getting like 230 FPS limited by the CPU. Now, I could start cursing my CPU for limiting me, but at the same time, I was getting 230 FPS. Like, who am I to complain at that? And as you see, we get a bit closer to the airport, it all starts to load in. You can see our FPS does start to drop away and we do start to become more CPU limited, though the FPS is remaining nicely in the 40s versus the 20 something that we sometimes experience as we come into Edinburgh with our 5800X3D. Getting the odd stutter or two as we get closer to touchdown and seeing FPS numbers kind of in the mid to high 30s before recovering after we touch down. And we kind of recover back into the high 40s. Weirdly, as I taxied off of the runway towards the terminal, round about here, it seemed that we get kind of bogged down by the render thread, and we saw a little bit of flickering of the render thread on short final, I thought, and my gut feeling is that this is an Edinburgh version 2 issue that needs sorting out and isn't necessarily the 9800X3D acting up. Lots of you in the stream the other day said that you also get the same issue at Edinburgh. Back at the gate though, and we're holding up at around 50 FPS, which isn't bad. Back to being CPU limited, it seems. Next up, we're going to do the same thing again, but this time we're going to enable dynamic settings with a frame rate target of 40 FPS. The idea here, for those of you that don't know what dynamic settings is, it's a toggle in the graphic settings that will then tell the sim to dynamically adjust the terrain level of detail and object level of detail to achieve your FPS target. We've set it to 40. If the FPS looks like it will dip below that, it will basically start pulling on levers to bring down your train LOD. It's kind of an official built-in version of AutoFPS. Think of it like that. Now, keep an eye on the train LOD factor. Drop in the train LOD down for us to preserve FPS. Let's see if we can stick in the 40s this time. And yes, I'd say it is. It's, yeah, I don't know if you saw there, a very momentary stutter which took us into the 30s just for a microsecond. But other than that, that was pretty slick indeed. Points to dynamic settings, it would seem. It kept us, for the most part, above 40 FPS. So, as we discussed earlier, at 4K, we can sometimes be limited by the GPU. So let's get that GPU limit out of the way by going to 1440p. We're going to run this test without dynamic settings, and you can see that we are in the 60s, sometimes touching 70, and of course we are CPU limited. Though the closer we get, we do start to drop down into the 50s, occasionally into the high 40s, and as we get really close, we're now into the low 40s, high 30s, with a couple of stutters to go with it. Then once we're down, FPS does start to recover back up to around 50 FPS, much like we saw when we were testing in 4K. Next, we'll do the same thing again, this time though with dynamic settings switched on at 1440p, and see if that can bias anything back while we're on short final. And as you can see, as we get closer to the runway, look at that TLOD factor change showing us that the sim is dynamically adjusting the train level of detail to keep us above our 40 FPS target. And other than a brief micro stutter, just very, very briefly taking us into the 30s, that was much, much better, keeping us above 40 FPS pretty much the whole way down. That's very nice indeed. Keeping with 1440p and my optimized graphics settings, we'll try the same landing, but this time with AutoFPS rather than dynamic settings. For those that don't know, AutoFPS is a third party, totally not approved by Asobo tool that, like dynamic settings, automatically adjusts your terrain level of detail, object level of detail, etc. to preserve FPS. And you can see that on short final, it's more or less the same as dynamic settings, though I will say I've been having some issues with dynamic settings of late, where everything can look quite blurry, even when you're kind of at 10, 15, 20,000 feet. It's almost like it's too aggressive sometimes, even when it seems like there's no need for it. I don't know, it could just be a me thing and it might get fixed, but AutoFPS does seem to do a lovely job of keeping us up in the 40s for the most part, while keeping detail nice and sharp, at least perceivably to me anyway. Okay, off to London Heathrow now. I wanted to come here, because this is Anybuild's Heathrow, the new one that's, 2024 ready. And also we've got London right next door, which brings its own set of challenges. Back at 4K with TAA, with no dynamic settings, no AutoFPS. We're not doing badly here on the approach, not too far off of 60 FPS. And like at Edinburgh, it's a mix of being CPU and GPU limited, which, again, isn't an awful place to be. As we get closer, you can see the FPS start to dip away ever so slightly. Not sure why the runway looks weird, but whatever. Mostly staying above 40 FPS on short final, and only a very momentary dip into the 30s. If we then enable dynamic settings, this time with an FPS target of 45 versus the 40 that we had at Edinburgh, you can see our terrain level of detail factor starting to kick in. And as we get really, really close, you can see that it's gone all the way to 0.5, which is its limit. I don't think it can go any lower than that. So I'm presuming that it's halved our terrain level of detail and there's no more it can do for us on that front. But that's quite the show. 50 FPS or just below, pretty much all the way down, nice and stable. That is a really, really good result. Now I think it's time we tried another plane, ideally an honest-to-goodness Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 plane. So let's jump into the PMDG 777 Freighter, and at 4K with my preferred graphic settings, again without dynamic settings, you can see that we're mostly at or around 50 FPS, but it does start to dip into the 30s on short final. And even as we re-enable dynamic settings, you can see that on short final, there's still a bit of a kind of periodic stutter going on, almost like there's a rhythm to it. And it gets even worse just as we touch down. So yes, the 9800 X3D is a very powerful chip, but don't be thinking you're going to be immune from stutters with it. Even switching into 1440p with dynamic settings enabled, you can still feel that periodic stutter. You can see it on the frame time graph too if you look closely. I don't know whether it's an Asobo thing or a PMDG thing or what. I don't seem to recall noticing it on the Fenix during flight. Anyway, stutters to one side. The frames do seem to be really nice though, as considering where we are, Heathrow, London, etc. Sticking with 1440p this time, we're going to run with AutoFPS, and again, those periodic stutters are still present, but otherwise still a very nice result, similar to what we got with dynamic settings, though, like I said, I sort of think AutoFPS does a nicer job of retaining visuals. I've been having some weird issues with dynamic settings, turning things into a bit of a blurry mess. So what if we stick with AutoFPS and connect to VATSIM, staying at 1440p to make sure we're staying clear of any GPU bottleneck? You can see on the ground it's quite busy at Heathrow at the time that I'm testing, which is convenient. We're connected in observer mode, so don't worry, we're not going to cause a problem for those actually doing real flights on VATSIM. So will the combination of VATSIM, AnyBuilds Heathrow and London being nearby be enough to ruin us? Let's find out. So far, it seems maybe not. It's doing pretty well, maintaining close to 50 FPS as we come in on short final. Seeing some high 30s as we get close to touchdown, but I think on the whole, that is a pretty good result for a reasonably busy Heathrow Airport with, traffic kind of trundling around on the ground. That is, of course, live VATSIM traffic with FSLTL running in the background as well. As we taxi to Terminal 5, we're still knocking around the high 40s range, sometimes low 50s, which is really nice. Just to see the effect that VATSIM has on our system, we're disconnected here, sat on this taxiway, getting around 63, 64, 65 FPS. And then when we reconnect, we're sort of peaking at around 55, 56, 57. So VATSIM is pretty much costing us around 7 or 8 FPS on the 9800 X3D, which I think is quite an interesting observation. So then, what about some frame generation? Now, as I'm on a 7900 XTX from AMD, I won't be able to use NVIDIA's frame gen tech, but thankfully now AMD FSR3 frame gen has been natively implemented into the sim, so we can make use of that. Back into the Fenix then, coming into land into Edinburgh with my preferred graphic settings with AutoFPS running at 1440p just to make sure we don't get GPU bottlenecked. You can see that we're kind of getting in the region of 110 to 120 FPS on approach, and we start to get lower. You can see AutoFPS starting to adjust that terrain, LOD, and our FPS starts to get closer to around 100 FPS. Now, if you're wondering what the non-frame gen FPS is, pretty much divide by 2 and you'll get the answer. Now, I'm not the biggest frame gen fan, as you might have noticed if you've watched any of my other videos. As I said before, I think it's more of a frame smoothing technology versus a frame generation technology. As even though we're getting close to 100 FPS in our FPS counter here, my joystick inputs are still being sampled at my pre-frame gen frame rate, so around about 50. So while it might appear smoother, it won't always feel smoother, as all frame gen is doing is taking 2 frames from the game engine and stuffing another one in between the 2, basically, which actually delays the second game engine frame from reaching your eyes, which kind of isn't ideal in terms of input lag and things like that. But whatever, if you like it, good for you. I don't mind it. it's just I don't necessarily believe that I'm getting 100 FPS here, despite the fact that it's telling me I am. I believe I'm still getting around 50 with some generated stuff padding it out to make it appear smoother. Anyway, on touchdown, you can see we're getting around 80 to 90 FPS, which if you divide by 2 gets you around 40 to 50, which is what we had earlier without frame generation. So use frame gen at your discretion. I generally really don't like it for any kind of first-person shooter style of game, but for the sim, the level of motion is so low, even on short final, I feel like it gets a pass. But yeah, just don't believe the marketing nonsense from the GPU manufacturers. They're not real frames by any means. Now, what kind of performance testing video would this be if we didn't go to Gatwick? This is the freeware version of Gatwick from flightsim.to, known for being a fairly heavy hitter in terms of performance. So let's stay at 1440p again, because we don't want to become GPU limited. We're going to keep AutoFPS on, and let's see how we get on. So on approach a few miles out, and we're not doing badly at all, in the mid to high 50s. As we get closer, we're starting to see high 40s, low 50s, which is pretty epic considering that this is the freeware version of Gatwick after all. As I wrestle with the rudders, maintaining 50 FPS more or less on the roll into Gatwick is pretty damn amazing. I'm now wondering if this is AutoFPS helping out here, so let's try one last run without AutoFPS running to see how the 9800X3D holds up. You can see on short final, FPS is a bit lower than what we had with AutoFPS, but not by a ton. This is really quite impressive indeed. We are comfortably out of the sub 30 FPS danger zone that I've become so used to experiencing on the ground here at Gatwick. So as we come off the runway and taxi to my usual stand of 567 at Gatwick, don't ask me why, I just like it there, it's an opportunity to reflect on whether this upgrade was worth it. I feel great about making this upgrade as it achieved what I wanted from it. I wanted to try and stay out of having my FPS dipping into like the 20s at busy airports on VATSIM. And I think coming into Heathrow on VATSIM earlier sort of proved that we've achieved that part of the goal. I wasn't that interested in having a new CPU get me like 100 FPS without any frame gen, although that would have been lovely. But what I really wanted was to increase the lows and make things more stable. And if we can have an FPS increase at the same time, great. And to a point we have, but we are still under 60 FPS at custom airports in custom planes while connected to VATSIM. So, that's kind of in line with what I expected. Maybe next then we'll get a new generation of CPUs from AMD or Intel in the future that can give us 60 plus FPS consistently, even on short final right before touchdown. But even as I say that out loud, that kind of feels like an impossible thing that could ever happen in the sim. I don't know. The sim is still the sim, and I feel like throwing hardware at it starts to feel like a bit of a band-aid solution after a point. I think I'd really like to see some improvements coming from within the sim itself now before I go throwing any more hardware at the problem. So, as we saw in 4K at some of the time, we were GPU limited due to us having a more powerful processor now. In order for us to let the processor run to its full capacity, we had to drop down to 1440p. So it seems I've got a monitor-based decision to make. Right now, I'm running on a 4K 60Hz TV, which means if I'm not sending the TV a locked 60 or 30 FPS, obviously 30 divides nicely into 60, it's not the greatest as you get juddering, tearing, etc. So without frame gen, I tend to cap out, as we've seen, at about 55-ish FPS, which isn't quite 60. And with frame gen, we blow right past it, kind of up to 110, 120. And again, that's going to give you a lot of tearing. I did try the sim out on my new 32-inch 1440p monitor that I got for my PC in the house. But honestly, after so long simming on a big 4K screen, I really didn't like it. It feels so much less immersive when you're playing on a smaller screen. I got the 32-inch display last week on Amazon Prime Day for a deal of £177. So I thought if it's good, I will grab a second one for the house and one for the shed. But I think I'll be shelving that idea. It's great for the house, for editing videos and things like that, but not for out here simming. I could mod my user config file, I guess, to limit my FPS so that the sim runs at 30 FPS, then FrameGen doubles us to 60. But I really dislike throwing the idea of throwing away 20 plus real frames per second and then replacing them with fake ones, especially having just spent a ton of money on a new processor upgrade. So then, the next and probably more sensible play is to get a large 4K 120Hz screen with variable refresh rate. Therefore, whatever FPS I can throw at it should be displayed nicely without any tearing. The upgrade cycle never ends, it seems. As for whether the upgrade was worth it financially, that's a hard one for me to answer, as I've sat on this for months now, holding off mostly due to the costs involved, and coming from an AM4 socket CPU like the 5800X3D, moving to the 9800X3D required a whole new motherboard and RAM setup, putting the upgrade price in excess of £800. However, in my case, I found some of my old games consoles in the loft, traded them into CEX for a voucher, and bought a 9800X3D and 64GB RAM kit from them using the voucher. All I had to stump up for was the motherboard, which was about 180, so it didn't feel like I was spending all that much money, even though I kind of was. Either way, hopefully, if you are considering a similar upgrade yourself and are unsure of what to expect in terms of performance, hopefully this gives you some kind of idea of what you're likely to get at custom airports with custom planes using VATSIM and the like. Let me know if you got any questions, and if you found today's video useful, leaving a like will really help out a ton for the video and both the channel, and get subbed so you don't miss any future content or live streams. Thank you very much for watching, folks, and as always, look after yourselves, be good to each other, and happy flying.